Hey everyone, welcome to another advanced sports analytics application tutorial. In this video, we're going to be covering our player distributions application, fairly simple and straightforward app, just for viewing players' range of outcomes. It can be valuable in understanding, independent of some kind of matchup specific and roster, active or inactivity. Uh, just how players compare to one another from a median standpoint, but also range of possible outcomes. If we look at, we can type in players' names to search players and add them to the distribution plot above. We can look at them either on FanDuel or DraftKings scoring. We can look at their distribution per game or total and per minute. We can also select or deselect to show quantiles. I typically enjoy using the quantiles as it's a good just way to compare players median to median, 75th percentile to 75th, floor to floor, stuff like that. Um, so like looking at James Harden versus Giannis, typically similarly priced, at least on DraftKings. And we can see median, like they compare similarly, both kind of around 58 points. Looks like Giannis might be 57, which is cut off a bit. Um, Very similar from like a median standpoint. It's very interesting though how Giannis has this super tight distribution where his um, his 75th percentile outcome, which is this thick dashed line, of only 65 compared to Harden's 75th out distribution, 75th percentile outcome, at least over the last 2 years, and maybe we can subset onto really the last year and a half, but seems to be more of the similar story. Looks like last year plus this year combined, actually, Giannis had a higher median outcome than Harden. However, Giannis's distribution is super tight. Like his 75th percentile outcome was only 67 compared to Harden's 75th percentile outcome in the low 70s. It looks like here, maybe 71 or 72. Um, and Giannis over the past year plus hasn't really flexed the ceiling above 80, really above 77. I guess he's flexed the ceiling above 77, but his 95th percentile historical outcome was only 77 fantasy points compared to Harden's 95th percentile historical outcome of 82 fantasy points. So over the last year or so, we can make the case that even though Giannis has kind of a higher floor than Harden, certainly a higher median and a higher kind of 25th percentile outcome than Harden, Harden has this access to a ceiling that is, appears to be a clear 5 points or so more than that of Giannis. We can also look at players' distributions on a per minute basis. For players in kind of static or similar roles, uh, perhaps not that useful, but there are instances where we might have a player who has historically been in some reserve or backup role thrust into the starting lineup, understanding their distribution of fantasy points per minute, and then applying that to some elevated or maybe decreased, but I think we're kind of wanting to focus on players that are expected to receive more minutes than they typically do. I think could be a good way to just understand loose projections for players and loose possible future outcomes for players who are in maybe a different role than they have historically occupied. So I know tonight Michael Porter Jr. is expected to be out, so I don't know, maybe we can expect more minutes for like Monty Morris, um, albeit they do play somewhat different positions, so might not be the safest assumption. But for the sake of the exercise, if we were wanting to generate projections for Monty Morris stepping into the starting lineup, where historically he might have only been playing, in the low 20s in terms of minutes, it's hard to project him for much more than 20 fantasy points. He would need to achieve either some role that is in excess of kind of the median minutes projection that we or some other site might have for him, right? And he can do that through kind of not outlier, but just high end efficiency per minute. But short of him receiving 30 minutes as opposed to 20, there are a few routes to, let's say, Monty Morris in 20 minutes, putting up, I don't know, 30 fantasy points, right? He would need to achieve an efficiency of like 1.5 fantasy points per minute, which seems to be kind of outside of his range of outcomes. But if we were all of a sudden thrusting Monty Morris into like a 30-minute role due to some injury that kind of pushed him into the starting lineup, we can kind of see how the range of expected outcomes for Morris might be more applicable rather than looking at his per game distribution, which center is kind of below 20 and seems to have a ceiling kind of in the high 20s, low 30s. If his ceiling per minute is kind of just above 1, and all of a sudden he's in some role where we're projecting him for 30 minutes per game, let's say, I think we could see how he all of a sudden has access to a ceiling that's quite different, and extrapolating that via per minute efficiency, I think is a really useful approach. So I find myself looking at this per minute distribution almost more than a per game distribution, but I think super useful function in this application.